Good morning, everyone, or at least good morning in Japan on our side of the world. My name is Chuck Kaiser with Midori Farm, and welcome to the Midori Farm Talk about bees. We have two lovely guests joining us today who are going to tell us all about these amazing little creatures who may play a real key role in our survival as humans. And as an organic farmer, I meet loads of bees every year. I don't meet a lot of honeybees, however. I meet lots of different kinds of bees. And my interest in bees stems mainly from these bees because those are the ones who are helping me to grow vegetables. Probably the most common bee that I see is either a bumblebee or a carpenter bee, which look very similar. Carpenter bees are probably the most common one for me, and they're giant, beautiful bees that are very slow and almost, you know, comical in the way they have to fly. It doesn't look like they're supposed to fly. They're so huge and furry and heavy and slow. But it's also very telling that something that's so seemingly clumsy can survive in nature, because nature's wants a creature that's really fast and aggressive and smart and good at everything. So to see this bumbling bee flying around my farm is really, really interesting. And through looking at some websites about these carpenter bees, I've found they're very harmless, as a matter of fact. And I've taken to petting them and scooping them up and moving them when I need to, otherwise just letting them go about their business. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker for tonight, Max Spiegelberg, who's a bee researcher here in Japan. Max, please take it away.
Thank you, Chuck, and thanks for having me here. It's a good start, I think, what you mentioned about the farming and the different kinds of bees, because in the end, honeybees are one of the biggest categories of species out there. There's really a lot of kinds, and so the bee category, but the honeybees are actually only 7 or 9, depends on what research you look at. And here in Japan, we have 2. There's the Japanese honeybee and there's the Western honeybee that has been about 150 years ago, basically from America. So when Japan was opened up, so to say, they brought over the honeybees as well, which happened in a lot of places. And I think that's the same for Canada as well, where originally there wasn't a honeybee.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I've heard that honeybees were actually imported to North America from Europe. Is that correct?
Right. I think in most places it's part of the colonial history, I guess, that honeybees were brought all over the world. So there's bees in many different kinds of bees in local situations. But yeah, the one that are being raised is usually based on the Western, the European, German or Italian, or sometimes the Russian honeybees.
How many honeybees are there? How many kinds of honeybees are there in Europe?
Well, in Europe itself, I don't know actually how many. It's hard to say sometimes where's the boundaries, and there's changes in those numbers always. But overall, nowadays people say there's 9, and here in Asia we can find a few. Like the highest density of honeybees is actually in Asia. Oh. So more down, if you go towards Southeast Asia, there's several different kinds of honeybees where you can actually, that live as a colony together socially, and that produce honey that can be harvested. Otherwise, there's a lot of bees that live solitary, alone, and don't produce honey like we are used to. And I think, like you said, those are important for the pollination, actually. Those are the crucial ones, especially here in Japan, where a lot of the pollination actually happens through the wild bees and the wild honeybees. And one could say they have less of a lobby. They are less known because they don't produce the honey, they don't produce wax, right? But actually they are maybe more crucial as part of the ecosystem than the ones that we manage or that we're used to as a part of the Western culture, so to say.
Well, honeybees certainly get the lion's share of attention when it comes to bees.
Right, right. It's a key species, just like the whale or the panda. Basically, the honeybee has really a very positive image in environmental movements or in policy or the public attention in general. It's easy to connect. Here in Japan, it's a bit different, I would say. It doesn't have that same connotation like in European or Western media. People don't relate so easily to it because the honey consumption, first of all, is really much lower. Then the wax has been used historically in quite some long time ago. So it has been used to produce small Buddha statues as a mold. So originally from China, there was an industry for producing wax to make molds for Buddha statues. And that was introduced to Japan as well, but the production wasn't high enough. So they had alternatives. So, and in Europe, of course, it's always the candles for the churches. So a lot of the monasteries had beekeepers or beekeeping for producing wax for the church candles. So there's all these historic relations through the honeybees that we can see today still, which, yeah, in Japan. So the other issue is also that we have the hornets, as you know, right? There's all these different kinds of hornets in Japan, which are a different level, like you know, like a thumb-sized hornet. So and those guys also are called bees. So there's no difference here in the letter, in the kanji, in the writing, in the speaking. They are all bees. While in Europe or in most other countries, you know, there's a difference between hornet, wasp, and bee, and you can separate the nice bee from the carnivorous hornet.
Yeah, I can definitely see how the Suzumebachi would drag any other creature down that's in the same category as it.
Right. So those that's an issue. Like people, the image mentally, there's this connection, and in reality, I mean. So here in the urban setting, for example, one difference between urban and rural situations in Japan is that once you're close to the forest or already in like semi-urban areas, those fringes around a city, you have a lot of Suzumebachi coming, or you have also other issues of bears. In a lot of regions of Japan, beekeepers have problems with bears, actually.
Yeah. I have a friend, John Speary out in Shiga, who has problem with bears coming into his bees.
They do come. They check out the hives. And so also the Suzumebachi come, and that's one of the things for urban beekeeping where people try to keep away the Suzumebachi better than you can. It's easier in the city than it's in the countryside. So in a way, the survival chance for the honeybees in the city is higher, for that reason at least. But on the other side, people are afraid that the honey, if you have a hive, it will attract the hornets to you.
Yeah.
You know, they will find it.
They will.
they can fly, like a hornet flies, what was it, like 50 kilometers or something? It's ridiculous. Wow. They can fly basically from here to Osaka.
Wow.
You know,
that's really far.
It's crazy. If you think about the distance for such a, you know, like.
Yeah. It's a big insect, but still, it's a small creature.
Right. It's quite far. Yeah.
Now, I think the Suzumebachi, the hornets, they're mostly interested in eating the larva. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it's right. So the hornets are carnivores, right? So they eat other insects. And yes, they would eat the larva. I think the bears are actually also mostly interested in the larva, the protein. It's not so much the honey, I think, actually, which they don't they don't mind probably, but I think the real reason is the larva.
That's interesting.
And yeah, but on a positive side here in Japan, if you have a functioning ecosystem, you know, there's even predators for these giant hornets as well. Like there's giant mantis, which you don't want to meet, basically. It's really big. And there's the tombi, what's it called in English? Hawk?
The kites?
Yeah, the kites. So the kites actually do attack hornet nests.
Wow, that's a tough bird.
It's a tough bird. It's crazy if you see it once. And the positive things, so the Japanese honeybee actually can also protect itself from the Japanese hornets.
That's
and the Western honeybee
cannot. Jump on it and they superheat it, right?
Or right. Like they make a ball. around the hornet and basically suffocate it. Like it's a mix of heat and drawing out the oxygen by flapping the wings.
Wow.
And that can work, like for some. If it's a crazy attack, it doesn't. And the Western honeybee doesn't have this mechanism. They haven't learned it yet.
That's right.
And so keeping Western honeybees in Japan is, for that reason, quite challenging, actually. In that sense, the local original Japanese honeybee is much more adapted to the ecosystem and fits better usually. Just has the problem.
What's the appeal of
Yes.
having a Western honeybee colony in Japan? Why would somebody want to do that?
Right. So mostly it's a commercial. It would be for commercial reasons because they produce more honey. It's in a way almost double amount of honey production from a Western honeybee, like because they're so domesticated, right? They have been bred over and over again to produce more, to fly more, which of course also creates issues like we see in all industrial agriculture. If your food system relies on, you know, just a very few selected species and very few superbred species, then that can create issues over time, basically. And it's the same in chicken or cows. You know, if you look at cows everywhere in the world nowadays, it's Holstein cows, and it's the giant the big amount of pigs or chicken is also one out of the many types of chicken. It's always one for industrial purposes, and the honeybee in a way is going in that same direction where it's being bred more and more towards this one function, and it reflects the farming, right? It's if you look at mass agriculture, and
it's all the same.
It is also problematic, and then all these cascade effects come through of there's no more predators, or there's no balance, there's no control anymore of pests, and so on. And like your farm in a forest environment, basically, right? The Japanese forest is very similar. It's for extraction, it's a kind of monoculture forest, which is not a good environment for honeybees like the Japanese honeybee to live in. Usually they would live in forests as well, but if you have such a monoculture forest, then that it's not a good location, and then it's also not good for any predators or just one kind of animal, maybe. So it creates really an imbalance in the systems usually.
So you're speaking about the cedars as the monoculture,
right? Yeah, it's a lot of the cedars. Yes,
it's a very invasive species, and it eliminates all the undergrowth and all the flowering trees as well, which of course would greatly affect the honeybee's success rate. Yeah,
that's part of the issue, right? So the Japanese bee usually likes this this mixed landscape, because you asked about the benefits of having a Western honeybee, right? It is very much used to collecting one type of flower, and it's famous for its dance and its coordination. You know, one bee, the scouting bee, finds sunflowers and tells the others, and everybody goes to the sunflower field.
Wow.
And so you end up with, in the Western beekeeping, you can end up with a frame or a box full of sunflower honey, basically, and you can sell one jar with one taste. And that's almost impossible for the Japanese honeybee, because there's such a foraging, the collection of nectar is way more diverse. They are not so focused on one location. They actually just circle and collect what is close around, and circle bigger circles. And so you end up with something called yakamitsu, so which is like the 100-flower honey. That's what it's called. And it's always a blend. It's a seasonal blend, basically. So you have your spring blend and your fall blend. And it, of course, it can vary with whatever grows in your landscape and wherever you are in Japan. So every honey is still different. And if you have some soba farmer, or if you have some other farmer close to you, buckwheat or sunflower or whatever, then of course your Japanese honey would also be different. But yeah, they're very specialized on the small flowers, the weeds, and because it's really still a semi-wild or wild species. So the beekeeping is actually really different in its style also, because it's not so domesticated.
I know that
it doesn't work the same way.
In America, especially in California for almonds, using bees as pollinators is a huge business for beekeepers. Is there something like that in Japan going on?
So, well, that operation in the US, in a way, yes. I mean, it's special. The American situation is really special. It's extreme. But here in Japan, there's also beekeepers, commercial beekeepers, which are doing. They migrate from Kyushu, so they overwinter in the south in Kyushu, and then with spring they move up through Japan, through Honshu up to Hokkaido. So they are in the summer in Hokkaido, which is the large transformed agriculture basket kind of Japan, and then they move back down to Kyushu and back over winter in Kyushu. But that's like really companies. The size is still different than in the US. I mean, in the US, a big beekeeper is what, I don't know, 10,000 hives or something. It's crazy amounts with trucks. It's huge corporates, and in Japan, the biggest one I met for an interview, they had like 1,000 hives, I think, and that was really big already in Japan.
Were they Japanese bees or Western bees?
No, Western. You cannot truck the Japanese bee. It doesn't. It's not. It doesn't allow it. Basically, if you move the box, if you open it every week, like you're supposed to open the Western honeybee to check for mites and health and all this stuff. If you do that with the Japanese bee, it will just abandon you. They just leave you. They don't want to be checked and disturbed, and they do their thing. And so the beekeeping is really much more close to something I think it would be called like natural beekeeping or Darwinian beekeeping or organic beekeeping kind of. Because you really need, like, the human has to adapt to the cycle of the ecosystem and the honeybee. You really have to go with it. If you try to put your rhythm into the bee, it's not going to take it. That doesn't work with the Japanese bee. And the Western bee, because it's domesticated, it's possible. It's trained to be trucked. But again, there's research basically saying that overall, trucking all your honeybees of the country to California and then to Portland for blueberries and then to the Middle West for I don't know what, it's not, like, long term, it's not good. It's for health, like health of honeybees and health of the industry. It's not like this is not being criticized also in the US, and there's other styles of beekeeping possible, but like for California, basically it would take a land reform and an agricultural reform to reverse this. It's like imagine it's what's going on there is basically like it's like these catastrophic famine food relief. You send airplanes and trucks into an area where there's a drought or a food emergency. You truck in everything you got to just survive.
Yep.
And they do that since the 70s now every year. It started as a one-off, supposedly. It was a short-term thing, but it's an emergency manner, an emergency mode basically that has been
become the norm.
and put into the system, and people make profit of it. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Max.
Healthy.
This is great. This is so wonderful. I've got some questions, people wanting questions.
Yeah, sure.
Do you mind if I open it up for that?
Yeah, let's go. Yeah.
Okay, good. I know Simon said he had a question, so if you want to ask away, you're welcome to.
Hello, Max.
Hey.
Thank you for your talk. So one question I have is, what do you see? Do you see the beehive, the beekeepers in Japan using only Japanese or either only Western, or do they have a mix of the two different kinds?
So we did some survey on that actually. We surveyed about 350 beekeepers in Japan, asking also that question. And there's a clear divide. So on the one hand, you have something like family businesses, which sometimes are doing it since 100 years. And this is all Western beekeeping. Like, it's really commercial. They sell equipment, they sell queens, they truck it around sometimes, they get paid for pollination.
Okay.
And on the other hand, there is a lot of the small hobby beekeepers that have like up to maybe 10 hives, maybe 5 on average.
Yeah.
And they're usually older guys after retirement. It's interesting. Well, like in Europe, for example, the most new beekeepers, people who start beekeeping nowadays, because they got aware we need to do something, and you know, for the environment we have to do something, and in the city or for the young kids they should learn something. So all this is usually young families in Europe, but in Japan it's mostly old guys after retirement, and they make the box themselves, like crafting, and it's a pet. So we asked them, and for them, like, so a lot of them, they said it's a pet or a friend, kind of. So the honeybee becomes a pet, the Japanese honeybee.
Okay.
And they take pictures of it and selfies and all this stuff. It's quite funny. And then for the commercial ones, it's like employees. They said, well, the bee is an employer, or it's
so it's really for profit.
staff. It's my staff.
Yeah.
So it's really different attitudes. And then of course there's some which are in between. They're trying out stuff. They want to experiment. They're just interested in it, and you find also those. And the third category, I would say, which is growing in Japan, is there's a lot of projects. So almost every city, we found in 70 cities there's honeybee projects, which means it's like almost every city in Japan has some kind of project, either in a school. So there's a lot of educational projects. It's like university clubs, like activities run by students, sometimes for research, sometimes for fun. In school, it's often for education. And then there's like social projects for like community revival, or like older people together and do something together, just an activity. And then there's also something like CSR projects. So there's sometimes companies which are running public projects on a rooftop in Tokyo, or on a rooftop in Osaka or something. Or so it's a mix. It's kind of CSR, but it's also community engagement for sometimes companies or staff, just for the staff to do beekeeping, for example, as a company activity. So we found, and those often use Western bees because they are in frames. It's easier to like, there's a manual. In a way, it's easier. It's more delicate. You can see it. The Japanese bee, because you cannot open the box so often, then it's more guesswork than
more
right. The
experience.
interaction is not so high. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Simon. Does anyone else have any questions for Max? Yes, Lee, I think, has a question.
Hello, hi. I'm
hey.
Lee. I'm actually Singaporean, but I live in Kyoto. And I'm restoring this farmhouse in the Kumano region, a place called Ryujinmura. And there used to be a farm there, and I'm trying to plant lots of different kinds of stuff there, because it's now just a cedar forest and just empty land. So in that region, in Ryujinmura, they have been quite proud of their bees in the past. And in the past, the emperor used to visit to buy honey.
Right.
But in the last 50 years, the number of people keeping bees has dropped, and there are beehives in the village still, but they're all abandoned. My question is, the locals, that older people, say that bees only want to be in tree trunks. They normally find the old tree trunks, they carve a hole, and the bees go there. But the problem is that when they harvest the honey, they topple the entire tree trunk and they dig out the honey. So my question is, does that affect the bees, the local Japanese bees? And if I want to learn how to keep bees for honey, like wild Japanese bees for honey, is there someone I should talk to in Kyoto or in the Kumano region?
You're in Kumano. Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah, I can connect you later with someone, I think, because I'm doing the research here. Basically, I'm part of a research project. First of all, it's a food project.
I've seen the Feast website.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, exactly. And so most of the research I did with 2-3 colleagues, and one of them is Rika Shinkai, and she's originally from the Kumano region. And so she went back to Kozagawa. You know Kozagawa?
No.
It's kind of East Wakayama.
Okay.
A bit south of Ise. And so there, it's still everybody keeps the honeybees in tree trunks. Like you said, Wakayama is really known for the tree trunk beekeeping. And we'll provide you the link to the homepage. You can see all these different types of hives in Japan. There's so many types of boxes. And so the tree trunk beekeeping, like you said, it is again also a bit different. The people make a lot of hives and put them out to the forest and just wait till somehow the bees move in. It's really it's so they spare the migration in a way. They let the bees migrate from box to box in a way, and then they go and take the box and, like you said, clip it and carve out the plates. And of course, like it can be a problem for many years. That has reduced the populations because they just took out everything, right? You remove not only the honey, but you also remove the brood, the new bees or the queen cells, and that in a way is not maybe the best solution nowadays. And there is beekeepers in that area which change the practice. So, you know, on the plate, if you have the bee plate, on the top you have honey, and then you have brood and pollen. And what you can do is people cut it and then stick back with skewers or with wooden sticks. You can put back the plate. So you just take the honey out and put the back into the tree trunk. So beekeepers started doing that. It becomes really a beekeeping, right? The people really keep something. Before it was more a bee harvest, honey harvest.
Yeah, bee hunting. Yeah.
Right. It was more closer to the bee hunting and to the honey hunting, and so that has changed. It is possible to put back those to put back the brood and keep the hives and stuff. It is possible with the Japanese bee in that situation.
I'd love to visit someone doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, let's see if we can, if there's a way. Otherwise, she has what we have done and what's on my colleague's homepage is a video of. So she started recording this because all these beekeepers in that Kozagawa area, they are not 80 or something, right?
Yeah.
There's, like you said, there's no young people, and everybody is old, really, really old, and all this knowledge is kind of getting lost. And in that area, she also found Smith, which produced really like hand-produced tools for the beekeepers still.
Wow.
So there's all these kind of setups still existing, but it is about to disappear. So yeah, it's good if some people would start to pick it up and continue it. And in that Kozagawa area, there's a younger person which is 60, which is trying to maintain the beekeeping. And he was the local mayor also and stuff. So I think he's very busy with everything because he's the young one. But yeah, there's some people I think to connect with.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, one more question is some of the villagers say you have to use sakura trees, while others say that you can use any other tree. But the problem is the sakura tree is that a hive is going to be about this big, and how are you going to find a sakura tree that's this huge?
No. Yeah, I think that's not the case. I mean, there's different wood has different qualities. The bees prefer different. It doesn't need to be sakura though. I think it's okay. Yeah, there's preferences. I know they used sakura for attracting bees also, but like the bark, somehow there's something in the bark maybe that has been used as an attractant, like a trap. They build traps that attract the honeybee when they swarm. But I think the hive does not need to be from sakura, as far as I know, because you're right. It needs to be a really old sakura otherwise.
Yeah, I'm just asking because the cedar tree hives are all empty, so I'm wondering if it's a problem with the cedar trees that the bees don't like.
No, I think so. Last point, maybe it's so one of the problems that has been going through Japan in the last years was a mite. There's a problem of the tracheal mite in English, I think, which it lives in the lungs of the honeybees. I mean, imagine the size of that mite. It's just super tiny, and it's not visible, and it's hard to find out. And then, like, when you find out, basically, it's quite too late. Like your hive just slowly suffocates. It's really terrible stuff. So it feeds on the lungs in the honeybees, and then they get tired and die out, basically. And I think that might be one of the issues why more and more populations are kind of disappearing in a lot of areas. It has been in some time, and if it arrives now even in these remote areas of Wakayama, that would be really bad. because these people usually did not move the hives, and it's really more local. Like there's no influx. In some other parts of Japan, beekeepers still exchange hives or exchange bees. Sometimes they move the Japanese honeybee to some friend or something. But I know, especially in that Kumano Kozagawa area, people usually were, yeah, they just kept their local bees. They don't move them around. They don't sell them. They don't trade them. They don't give them. Yeah, so as far as I know, so far still nobody has researched, especially this area. We were thinking about that, but we didn't have time now. But I think it could be the larger problem at the moment is those mites, which comes from the Western honeybee, surprisingly. So it's a problem that has been moved from the one bee to the other, basically.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lee, for your great questions. And Max, thank you for all the great information. I'm going to post some stuff in the show notes. And this is also going to go up on YouTube later as a podcast. And in that, I will also list out how to contact Max if you're interested in getting more information, and any sort of useful links that he'll have for people as well. So, thanks, Max. I'm going to turn it over to our master beekeeper here, who is very humble. And I've known him for several years. He's a good buddy of mine, real kind of Renaissance person. Kenneth, please take it away.
Hi, good evening. Yeah, I'm one of those old people, though I wasn't always old. When I started beekeeping, I guess I was about 30 years ago, I suppose. I'm working, of course, with European honeybees, which are an introduced species, and technically speaking, I suppose they are an invasive species. And certainly, the time of colonization in America, the European honeybee, Apis mellifera, was advancing faster than the settlers were. So the indigenous people, it was the first warning that the indigenous people had, was the white man's fly was advancing ahead of them. The situation, of course, is very different with the European honeybee, and Max has explained some of the historical part of it. We don't actually consider the honeybee to be domesticated. It's just that we've figured out what its basic habits are and how we can work within its particular system, its way of existing. And discoveries, say, in the 19th century about the critical bee space, which is about 3/8 of an inch. Of course, I'm talking from the North American perspective, but it's just about 9 millimeters, I think. And you try and keep your equipment that far apart so the bees can actually move up and down between the frames that you have. I mean, here's you see a classic deep, what they call a deep frame, and it's been drawn out into cells like that. And so that was the big breakthrough really in the 19th century was figuring out how one could have these removable frames and have in these ones the brood would be in there, the queen would be laying in there, there would be pollen deposited in there, there would be honey in there, and the brood would exist there, and they would put their surplus above that. And so that was how commercial beekeeping developed, from that notion about how to remove things, how to take things apart, and build things commercially and industrially. The Japanese system is very similar to one that was developed in France, which is called the Waré system, and which is a kind of a total loss system, unless, like Max says, you cut it apart and then you stick it all back together again in the box. If you Google Japanese beekeeping, you'll find some actually very, very interesting stuff, not only on YouTube, but also text with good pictures. And I would recommend that very, very highly, actually. There's one particular site where he does a really good job of explaining how it's done, or how you put the boxes together and in which sequence and so on and so forth, and the harvesting, and quite a bit about the Apis cerana, which is the little Japanese honeybee, and which is it's endemic here in Japan, also Korea, China, and then you go further. Well, I guess it's west, isn't it? And you get the giant Asian honeybee, and if you know, the National Geographic specials of these guys climbing up cliffs to take these enormous natural cones down from the cliffs there. Now let's start with the photographs here, and I'll just run through essentially my commercial year as a harvester. And here we got the three castes of bees. The most populous one is the worker, the one on the left, and it's technically a female. They can lay eggs under very stressful circumstances, but you don't want that. That's in fact the last thing you want, and then if you get into that situation, you've got a serious matter happening. It's not, I mean, it can be dealt with, but there it is. And in a nice strong hive, you'll have 50,000 bees. The vast majority of them are going to the worker bee there. On the right-hand side, you've got the drone, and drone is it's like a real male. All of us, I think, are guys watching this, so I can say that all it does is think about sex, and that's its only function. Eats a lot, needs to, because it needs to fly very fast. As you can see, it's big. It's really tough. It's got enormous eyes compared to the others. It needs to see that virgin queen zipping past. And those antennae are much, much more surface sensitive than both the queen antenna and the worker antenna, because it needs to sense that queen's pheromone as she's flying past. Finally, in the middle of the queen. Now, the queen is not a queen as far as royalty is concerned, but she controls the genetic situation in the hive, and most hives exist with only one queen. Sometimes you have two, but that situation doesn't last very long, because they'll be sizing each other up, and eventually one will catch the other one and sting it to death. And let's see, the next one, please. Now, these days, with the way things are going in beekeeping in North America, and I suppose too in Europe, with encroaching urbanization, toxicity of the environment, and lack of biodiversity, then back in the day, and I certainly try as much as I can every year, is to split my hives and to have a situation where I have strong hives in the springtime, and they're strong enough for me to be able to take one hive, split it into two, and then get a honey crop out of both of them. But that's not always possible, because like in the wintertime, you get quite a bit of die-off, and I think that really nowadays 30% die-off is acceptable, which would have been unthinkable 20, 30, 40 years ago. And with the Varroa Mite, which is everywhere except for New Zealand, so far it hasn't got there, we're down to importing a lot of bees from New Zealand. And this is an example of how they come. You get a box of, say, 2 pounds of bees and a queen. And that's going to cost you $240 just for one of those. I'm trying to stay away from that, certainly. And if I have to purchase bees from other places, then I do it locally, within 100 kilometers. In fact, I have a very good bee supplier there. And I get them, and I'll have a box, a nucleus hive. I've got one behind me, but it's rather inconvenient. Well, actually, there's one on the right-hand side of the picture there. You can see a nucleus hive. It'll take about five frames there. And that's how I will get extra bees there, and that's how I will split the bees. So, but that's not a honey-producing hive. That's simply a hive that I would use to build up a colony, and then I would move that into an ordinary hive. And let's go to the next picture, please. Yeah, so this is a yard, pretty standard yard, the European beehives. Right in the front there, you've got an electric fence charger. And this is mostly to do with bears for me. They're a really big problem, and they can destroy your entire yard in no time at all. As Max said, they're mostly interested in the brood. The honey's fine, of course. They'll knock it about. They'll destroy it. They'll just smash everything to pieces. I have you know, very, very basic system, except that my bottom board there, it's got screen, and that allows for, if I'm treating for mites, to drop down through the bottom board, and underneath that I have our cafeteria tray, and if I'm doing testing, I'll have a piece of plastic sheet on top of that, and I'll put some sticky material on that, Vaseline or what they call Crisco. It's like cooking fat. And if the mites drop down, they'll land on that and they'll stick there. And I can count them at that point. So after 24 hours of treatment, I'll go in and make a count, and I'll have a pretty good idea of what the infestation's like. Let's see. Yeah, nothing, no, the detail's not good enough for much more than that. So next one, yeah. Okay, so find the queen, anybody? It's an easy one, this one. I mark my queens, and I mark my queens by color. With the color represents the particular year. This last year was blue, and this year is white. And if we can go into the next one, Chuck. Yeah, so this is a really classic situation of how the queen keeps the hive together as a colony. Several times a day, I suppose, or several times, and you know, of course, it's dark in the hive anyway, so you know, day, night, whatever. Obviously, they're mostly home during the night, but you'll get this retinue of, say, 10 or a dozen very young bees, and they will be stroking the queen with their antenna and sometimes licking her. And they will be taking off a pheromone, which is, fairly volatile substance. And they will be, and the queen is covered with it. She creates it in mandibular glands, which are in her head, but it identifies the hive. This particular makeup of that particular queen, the chemical mix of that pheromone identifies that particular hive. And those young bees, they will, after stroking the queen for a few minutes, they will disperse into the hive, and they will touch other bees in that hive, and they're just dispersing the pheromone of the queen into that hive and maintaining the identity of the hive that way. As long as that pheromone remains strong, then that hive is in a good situation. Once that pheromone starts to get weak, then you're going to have a situation where they will want to replace her. It may be also that she's not laying as many eggs and she's getting old, or she was never properly mated in the first place. The mating situation, when we maybe go into later, I mean, that's my personal interest. The fascinating part of beekeeping to me is raising queens. And I pay for that by selling honey, of course. Yeah, there we go. Pollination. So this is really the important part. Of course, honey is fine. I mean, I sell that, I get money, and it's nice to have that business. But of course, the most important function of honeybees is pollination, and in North America and Europe too, of course. When we've talked about, Max has talked about the industrial situation really that's developed over the years, and it has everything to do with the way that farming has developed into an industrial situation with lots of mechanization and fewer people, and the elimination pretty much of the family farm. Obviously there are going to be exceptions there, but there in my particular area, which is not a good honey producing area because it's mostly forested, and what's not forested is a lake. And I have to go over the pass to the next valley in order to see some kind of industrial beekeeping. But even then, they might have 500 hives. I have 70, and that's plenty for me. But I have to disperse them as much as I possibly can. You can see the pollen on the legs of the bees. They transfer it from the flower back through their legs, and they have a very well adapted hind leg which crushes the pollen into a pellet after it's been mixed with a bit of nectar. And once they get back into the hive, they or the assistants can pull that pollen pellet off and ram it into a cell, and then it's capped with honey and then with wax, and then it's stored. In order to, it's an organic substance, and in order to preserve it, it needs to be mixed with enzymes and stored. Otherwise, it breaks down really fast. And if people ask me about buying pollen for human consumption, well, you have to deep freeze it very fast. Otherwise, it starts to break down. The benefits of pollen for humans, of course, it's not proven anyway scientifically. Here we go. This we obsess about. This is the Varroa Mite. If you get to the situation where you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 mites like that, well, that's a ghost hive already. That hive will probably not make it through the winter time. That's in fact a very bad situation, and thank God it wasn't one of my hives. But you can see that the larvae are dead there. They're just lying conked out in the bottom there. You can see these little white specks in the top of the cells, and that's the mite feces, and that's always a sign that the mites have been active there. They're visible, so we tend to obsess about them most. Max mentioned thoracic mites. They were a big issue some years ago in North America, and we've sort of forgotten about them, but they're still there. They do tend to respond to the same kind of treatment that we use for Varroa Mite here. Varroa Mite is everywhere, and like a lot of these things, it's really not a question of eliminating them. That's totally a waste of time. You've got to think about management, and in order to manage them, well, it's a whole question of knowing your enemy. I mean, what is the life cycle of the Varroa Mite, and how does it correspond to the life cycle of the honeybee? The Varroa Mite, its life cycle tends to correspond more or less to the gestation period of the drone, which is 24 days, as opposed to the queen 16 and the worker 21. So it does tend to head for the drone cells, which are larger. So I put a little extra drone comb in there, and I remove it. Check it first, see if check it first to see if there are any mites on the drone brood, and so on and so forth. After the spring of the year, the drone brood is, well, you always want drones if you're rearing queens, but it's so semi-expendable. So let's have a look at the next one, Chuck. All right, you can, I believe, see something here called deformed wing virus, where you can see the wings of the bees hardly exist at all. They're all, the little bee comes out of its cell, and it's just got, the wings are just vestigial at most. I mean, that bee, obviously, it may survive for a few days doing some basic jobs around the hive, but it will never get out and go foraging or anything like that. And quite often I see them crawling on the ground if I have any kind of like a mite infestation. But there again, that's one of your first signs usually. Of course, I mean, you might also see mites on bees, and that's always really a bad sign. I can talk about testing later, depends how much time we have. On to the next. Okay, if you manage to get anything at all, this is starting in the harvesting stage of things. This obviously always important to, it's a commercial operation of producing food. And so, it's important to keep things clean, and stainless steel, you know, some people find an old galvanized hand extractor and they say, can I use this? And I say, no, I mean, honey is very acidic. It's going to be eating the solder out of that extractor, and not to mention the zinc galvanizing. So that's really not good for you. So I mean, the best equipment. My extractor, that's an old picture. I think that extractor would take nine frames, and the one I have right now it takes 20. So it's twice the size. And the back there, the orange box is the honey box. It's shallower than the brood box. The brood box, you can see brood boxes behind there, and they're much deeper. If you had a brood box full of honey, you can hardly pick it up. But you can reckon for about 30 pounds anyway in the shallow boxes. And there's 10 frames in each box there, and that's sitting on my uncapping box. You can just basically see there is a tank under that. You know, I use an electric plane, which it's like essentially a wood plane. It's hot, and you draw it across the top of your comb there, and then the wax drops down into the box under there. There's a screen there. The honey drains out of that, and you can draw that off later. And you know, those uncapped combs that will go into the extractor, they'll be spun around, centrifugal force, come out the bottom, run through a screen. I put it in the 5-gallon bucket, and then it goes into the tank, which has got an electric element in there, and that's maintained at the same temperature as in the hive, which is 35 degrees or more or less centigrade. And so any more than that, then the honey starts to get degraded, and I can put it into jars from, you can see the handle there, and I put it into jars from there. And next one. Okay, the issue of honey falsification is an enormous one in North America, mostly because China, of course, in the end, is a huge producer of honey, but not necessarily a very good quality. And there is a real issue of adulteration of honey with rice syrup, that kind of thing. There are many other ways to adulterate honey. And of course, it's sold much cheaper. So there's always going to be people in North America who will move heaven and earth in order to import that and blend it or pass it off as real honey. The trick is, with honey, how you identify it is usually with the pollen. And so they heat it up and they force it at high pressure through a very fine screen and remove all the pollen. So you can't identify it by the pollen. You don't know where it come from. And then maybe you take a trip to Australia and shake a few trees and get a good collection of pollen, and you toss it into your so-called honey, and you can pass it off that way as real Australian honey or Manuka or that kind of thing. That's the kind of thing that's going on. So I send honey from each of my 6 yards, a sample from comb honey, down to the lower mainland, the Vancouver area, where it's passed through a machine which will analyze the cocktail of chemicals in my honey from that particular place, which represents the various species that that the bees are getting their nectar from. You don't have to move very far from that particular yard where the mixture is going to be a little bit different. So I mean that puts a kind of a stamp on that particular location. So anybody coming along saying, well, I produce honey from this location, well, okay, they look for the library of samples that they have there and they say, well, that doesn't represent it at all. Obviously, there's going to be some sliding scale as to what you're going to get. Dandelions in the beginning of April, right down to goldenrod in almost October, and that's then you have to take that into account as well. But basically, there's a thumbprint, as it were, a fingerprint from that particular hive, and as you can see, there's a little whiteboard there, and it's got the coordinates of that particular hive and the date and so on and so forth. Next one. So this is the fun part for me, meeting my customers and selling honey. I have two brands which really represent the two different communities that I have produced honey around. Nelson and Salmo, and I live at a place called 6 Miles. So that's the honey on the left-hand side, and Salmo honey on the right-hand side. You can also see little bottles of propolis tincture, which I make from propolis, with a scrape off the hive, or I can collect it otherwise, and you can see actually a very small piece of wax right next to that as well. And I render wax down from the cappings there. I wash that off, and that's so I can make mead from that, and which I don't sell that. I give that away as a good Christmas present. And if that goes all wrong, I can make that into vinegar, and that's also highly thought of vinegar, pretty much like sort of apple cider vinegar. On the left-hand side, the little green box there, you've got a nuke again, and on top of that, it's an observation hive. It's got a black cloth over it, because I want to keep it dark, and I want to keep the bees there happy there. And what I'll do is I'll pull a frame up from there, which has the queen on, and I'll put it in that little top section. It's got a queen excluder in the bottom, so the queen can't get down again for the duration of the time it's there. And people come along, and I'll flip the lid off, and I'll say, okay, so you can find the queen, and there she's quite happily laying eggs and being attended to by the workers in the drone, and there'll be drones in there inevitably eating, and so on and so forth. So it's a really good demonstration thing, and it brings it more home to people when they think of bees, collectively again as something that stung me, which was probably much more likely to be a wasp. Yeah, shall we go from there then, Chuck? I've lost your mic here.
You're right, Kenneth. I was muted there. Thank you. This technology stuff vexes me. So that was great, Kenneth. I know a lot of people have got stuff to say, so I'm going to open it up for people to comment. Maybe the person calling themselves Midori Farm, which I'm very curious about, maybe you could unmute yourself and ask your questions directly to Kenneth. Is the person around? Midori Farm is your name. You can unmute yourself and ask your questions, maybe.
Well, one thing about, am I still on the mic?
Yes, she said something about cells that drones are raised, or, oh, okay, maybe some people are answering the question for her. Oh, Emma Parsons, I'm sorry, Emma. Sorry, Emma, did you have a question you wanted to ask directly to Kenneth? You're still muted, by the way.
Hi, yeah. No, I was just somebody, Chris Agor S.
Yep.
He just asked the question to everybody, so I just took it upon myself to answer. That's all.
Sorry.
I don't know if it answered his question. Maybe an expert should answer.
Are you a beekeeper?
Yes.
And you're producing honey, correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Where are you located?
In Shikoku.
Okay. I think my good friend Catherine bought some honey from you.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. That's fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us. Do you have any questions for Kenneth?
No, I'll let the experts speak, and please, I'll keep quiet.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us, Emma.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Does anybody else have a question for Kenneth? Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering about how to demite the hive. Like, it sounds like you can't completely remove them. You were saying you take the drones out. They go for the drones, and you just remove the whole panel of drones. Is that correct?
That's one way. That's one way you can do it. I mean, this is more towards the sort of organic way of doing it. I as a commercial beekeeper, that's not particularly effective. You're using a whole palette of methods to try and reduce the mite population to something that's tolerable. so that the hive will survive and hopefully be productive. Otherwise, why am I in this business tormenting bees? By trying to make them do what I want them to do, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's livestock management. You have to do the best for your livestock. That's your moral imperative. And if you can make a profit, of course, or survive. I mean, I hardly make a profit, but I survive. Now, as far as treatment is concerned, like I said, I mean, the whole issue where we're trying to look at something called integrated pest management, which is understanding what the life cycle of the mite and how can we intervene in critical points of their life cycle where they might have weaknesses, and we can put a wedge in there. There are ordinary chemical treatments where I'm trying to move away from that, and I don't use the chemical treatments that using organophosphates and that kind of long chain molecule chemicals that affect the mite's nervous system. These, in any case, they're becoming less and less effective, like any chemical that's used in farming. They develop a resistance to it. I mean, their job is to survive, and they'll do everything they can, whether it's a coronavirus or it's a virus that a mite is vectoring through biting a bee. And it's like a mosquito. I mean, all they want is something out of the bee. And it's in the case of Varroa Mite, it's fat bodies. But of course, they inject something as well, like a mosquito does. So Zika, malaria, black water fever, all those things. So most of our problems, the visible ones, of course, are deformed wing virus, where you saw there, and another one called paralysis virus. So that would be usually plastic strips which are impregnated with the chemical, and you put them in the hive, in the brood area of the hive, for at least 2 brood cycles, so that the mites go into the cell, they're capped, they develop, they mature, they come out again, they breed again, and you put it through 2 brood cycles, and then you've got control. And we've gone through a few, and I think the last surviving one is one called Apivar, and it's still fairly effective. But I mean, how long that will actually last? And I try and stay away from that. What I'm using most of the time are 2 organic acids. One's called oxalic acid, and the other's called formic acid. And the bees can tolerate these pretty well. But formic acid, of course, occurs in when you get bitten by an ant. That's formic acid. So it does occur naturally. You'll get both formic acid and oxalic acid in way less than threshold levels in honey itself. Oxalic acid occurs naturally in rhubarb leaves and spinach. You'd have to eat an awful lot of spinach before it would do you any damage anyway. But that's I suppose spinach is natural toxin, and certainly rhubarb. But the way we apply that, see if I can see it here. Yeah, I live in a tiny home, by the way, and every single square inch of the floor is occupied with equipment right now, just in case you want to have a look at it. But I use something here. It's just called Oxivap, and what it does is you put half a teaspoon of oxalic acid crystals in this little cup here, and this is plugged into the mains, and there's a readout here, digital readout. It'll go up to 240 degrees, and you'll have it upside down, and you flip it over, and the crystals will fall on the hot plate there and immediately vaporize. And you want this stuck into the back of the hive when you're doing that. And you want to close the hive off, so that the least amount of gas escapes. And leave it for 10 minutes. The bees don't like it very much, of course. It's a very intrusive thing to do. But they tolerate it very well. And the mites don't like it, and they'll fall down. And that's where that tray and the white plastic was all about. After 24 hours, you count the mites that fall down, and then you make your decisions about whether you're going to continue on treatments. If it's that severe, well, you might treat again in a week's time or so on and so forth. I tend to treat with oxalic acid in the spring, and because it's most effective when there is not very much brood, because it catches the mites best when they're outside the cell and on the bees or on the surface of the combs. Formic acid, which somewhere here is an example of what I do, but essentially you soak a pad of anything, like you could tear a piece out of an old futon, and you soak a pad in, say, 30 mils of formic acid, 65%, and it's in a perforated Ziploc bag, and you put that on top of the hive, and it gas off over a period of time. It's a much longer process. You can leave it there for maybe 3 weeks while it gases off there again, going through at least one brood cycle, and it can penetrate through the wax capping. So in many ways that's more effective. Whatever you're doing with those, you need to be wearing a pair of very, very good gloves and a full face mask with acid gas pucks on it. If you start breathing that stuff, you're going to do permanent damage to your lungs. So the bees tolerate it, we don't. So that's the way I'm treating right now. Obviously, I'm making counts of, I'm doing tests. That's another thing I could demonstrate as well. But it's the screen quality is not that good. But obviously, I would rather not be, doing these pretty heavy treatments if I don't have to. So you have to decide with preliminary tests what your concentration of mites in the hive is and what can be tolerated. And if it's more than your threshold level, then you treat. If it's less than the threshold level, then you may treat later. But you're not, avoid hammering the bees all the time with all this stuff. It's not good for them.
That's great, Kenneth. That sounds like a really, really tough nut to crack organically with getting around these chemicals and everything else, but it sounds also very necessary. Max, did you have something to say about mites and stuff like that? Maybe?
Well, yeah, I can maybe add on to that. So, like Kenneth mentioned, there's the pressure, right? If you are a beekeeper, you're living from this, and there's a high pressure to treat and to handle this situation. And it's been, like also mentioned, right? The numbers are increasing of the losses. Like now in the US, it's around 30% over the winter losses or something, and that has been unacceptable usually before. Then the US is leading again, great again in a category in the world. Like in other countries, in Europe, I think it's around 20% of the winter losses, from what I know. And here in Japan, I think it's about 10 or 15. So there is different ways, and I think the interesting part is the Varroa mite originally comes from Japan. It's a Japanese mite from the Asian honeybee that has been, in a way, from what I know, it has been moved for research purposes towards Europe, I think, and then escaped the laboratory, or people were not careful, and it has spread all over the world, basically, and creates the problems that it's doing. And so I think that there's a lesson in that, first of all. Secondly, then the difference is that for the Asian honeybee, the Asian honeybee learned to deal with it. They are grooming each other. They are getting rid of it. They are living with the mite to a certain level that it doesn't harm or it doesn't threaten the survival of the colonies. I think that's one of the big differences for the beekeeping here as well. And from what I've learned, there's the honeybee type in eastern Russia, so actually not so far from here, right on the other side, so to say, the Primorsky honeybee, which is a blend of it has been around also just 100 years of, it's a blend of different types of Russian, Central Eastern European honeybees bred for this climate, and they also seem to be able to deal with it quite well. So there, and that is a more maybe a trajectory for the future of the question: is the Italian-based or the Western honeybee, is that the best option for living with Varroa? There might be other ways. And I think thirdly, what I could say, or fourth point, that there are researchers trying to figure out if Western honeybees could deal with it or learn it themselves. Can they survive on their own without being treated? And so there's researchers keeping honeybees like in forest or distance, really untouched, just having them survive it, fight it out in a natural selection process, trying to find out what it takes, how long it takes, and how honeybees, actually the Western type of honeybees, could deal living with the Varroa mites themselves. But I mean, that's research that also takes time to figure out the evolution of it, basically. But there are, so it is possible, which I think if that can be, you know, if those methods work over time, there might be a path to get away actually from all the chemicals again down the road in a way, and have beekeeping that is in rhythm with the mites and the hive itself. I think at the moment, of course, it's as in so many topics, I think it's an alarming situation basically, where it's really difficult to get out of for a lot of people. And yeah, resistance is always an issue. I think it will, I mean, at some point anyways, we have to find different solutions probably. So it's tough. Yeah.
Okay, I can step in there again. Yeah, I mean, the issue with the Russian honeybee, of course, it's pretty well known among researchers. But the issue is, of course, people want to make money and they don't want to spend, you know, put a lot of time into doing experiments on the side that, you know, may, you know, bring them profits in, you know, 10 years hence. But, you know, what could happen in between now and then? I would, you know, if anybody's interested in Google Kirk Webster. He's in Vermont, I think, and he has done a lot of work with honeybees and with Russian bees, but the number of death threats they had from his neighboring beehives was another issue, because, you know, if he wasn't treating bees at all, then some of those bees with mites on them were going to abscond to other people's yards and hives. So that's a big issue there. If you want to do that kind of thing, you really have to do it in a very isolated way, at least five kilometers, I would say, at least from somebody else's yard, which is perfectly possible. I mean, the place where I do buy excess bees from, she's a biologist, a bee biologist, and she has a yard where she is doing this ongoing research into no treatment bees. You know, I'm more concerned about people who are my neighbors and saying, you know, I can deal with it by, you know, saying a mantra or just letting them get on with it, you know, because that's the natural way. And of course, those bees are going to abscond into my hive, so I'm not going to be very happy about that. And I really want people to, if they're beginning beekeeping, to take a course, find a mentor, all this kind of thing. Do it hands-on. Don't, you know, just start off with a book and YouTube videos. I mean, you know, it's so much of it's hands-on, and it takes years to really develop a feel for it. You know, just open up a hive and listen to them. I mean, just the initial sound will tell you a great deal about what's going on in that hive. You know,
it's interesting, Kenneth, because as you mentioned, don't just buy a book and watch on YouTube, but when you recommended a reading list, one of on the top of it was Beekeeping for Dummies or something like that.
The Dummies, yeah. This is, I mean, it's a terrible title, of course, but actually it's the best single text you will find for a beginner. And even for someone like me who's been doing it for a while, there's interesting things in there, and it's very well illustrated. So I mean, you always want to read something as well. you know, in between the practical part of things, while you're doing your research about stuff that you wouldn't necessarily know from just opening a hive and having a look at it. And there's been enough research done over the last 200 years to tell you a great deal about what's going on in there, and that you really need to know that as well, you know. The biology of your honeybee, and that, you know, you need to know that. And, you know, yeah, like I said, doesn't cost a great deal of money. Get the latest edition, has Varroa in it, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah. And
that's great. Does anybody else have any other questions? We're actually over our time, but we don't mind extending this as long as it takes. If people have more questions or things to comment about.
Happy to answer questions here. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
North America, like
go ahead
Max,
and unmute yourself, Chris, and ask your question. Go ahead.
Hey, yeah, it's about bee die-off, and this is just a layman's question, actually, but neonicotinoids and pesticides being a greater factor, or the mites or the bees' immune system being weakened by the chemicals, or just, yeah.
Or climate change.
Climate change, yeah. Invasive species.
It's all of it.
Yes, I mean, it really is all of it. And I mean, it's amazing you can actually say neonicotinoids. It takes me, that's a real mouthful. But I mean, that's only one. I mean, you think about that, neonicotinoids are fairly recent. You know, before that, we had all kinds of other pesticides that were being used. And we don't really understand how Roundup or some other thing they engage together and destroy the soil base and destroy other pollinators or other beneficial insects that have just been eliminated with a broad brush. And of course, when we're talking about things like, you know, I mean, that has a lot to do with loss of biodiversity, including, I mean, in my community, this last 5 years, so many people who've moved away from Vancouver, moved away from Kelowna, and you know, mostly older people on one end of things, and they've retired and they've got a pension, and they think they deserve the garden beautiful, so they're going to get rid of all that, or spray for dandelions, or they're going to cut down trees and stuff like that, because they want the perfect thing that they saw in a magazine, you know, and they were dreaming about when they were pushing the desks for the last 40, 50 years. So, I mean, you get those attitudes, and then the attitudes of people who earn all their money sitting behind a computer and have moved to Nelson or someplace like that because they can work out of their living rooms with a computer and make a great deal of money and buy property and do that thing as well and do the organic beekeeping and so on and so forth, because they know everything because they found it on the internet or something like that. Climate change, I'm seeing that this year, the winter is incredibly mild. Normally I'm in Japan this time of year, actually. This is my connection with Chuck. I've been in Japan for the last 20 winters, and this is the first winter in 20 years that I haven't been in Japan. This has been a very, very mild winter. You know, almost every day of this last 2 weeks, there have been bees coming out, flying around. Mostly they get so far and they want to land somewhere, they land on the snow, and that's the end. Yeah. You know, yeah, that's the end of that bee. That normally you want it to be pretty damn cold, and they stay in there. I've got a couple of photographs here. I don't know if you can see this one. This is what it looks like out there right now. Or
hold it up a little bit higher, Kenneth. A little bit higher. There you go.
That's it. Okay, you can see the hives there totally in snow. And then this one here, that's a thermal imaging camera. So the good things are happening there anyway. So I'm not too desperate. There's living colonies in there, and they're putting out heat. So it's a handy little.
Max, maybe you can speak to the climate change effects here in Japan with the bees and stuff like that.
Right. Well, yeah. Right. I start with the climate change, and then I'll say something also to the neonics, I think, because it's relevant also in Japan. So for the climate change, one of the things that we have seen 2 years ago, or was the very hot summer in Japan. right? It was like the 2 years already, 1.5 years. The record high, 40-degree summer everywhere, and. And so what happened here for a lot of beekeepers is because in the Japanese beekeeping, you don't use the frame, right? So the comb is attached to the box itself. And also my colleague's comb, like the location where she had the hive wasn't ideal, and it got so hot that all the comb fell down in the tower.
Just melted?
It just melted. It was so hot that it lost attachment to the comb, and the comb dropped basically.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, that's it. So the bees just escape or the queen dies. And so that happened in the 2 year ago summer. And so it needs adjustment, right? So the locations of where you can beekeep, you have to factor that in now that there's even more heat in the summer you have to get rid of. And some people are adjusting the hives, you know, you have put ventilators or all kinds of things. So that's been an issue in the summer. And generally speaking, on a bigger picture for pollinators, what happens with climate change is that there seems to be mismatch occurring where the cycle of when the flowers open and the cycles when the pollinators hatch after the winter, it doesn't seem to overlap anymore necessarily. You know, there's a lot of insects which are quite specific for one type of flower. And if they hatch too early, or if they hatch too late, before or after the blooming, then there's a problem. So these types of patterns are changing with climate change as well. So that flowers might bloom too early or insects hatch too early. And I think for agriculture, the last point maybe is that some of the pests, so to say, pests which might have died off over winter, or which have less eggs, or all these type of factors, that might change. If there's a mild winter, you might have more certain types of insects coming out early, eating all your whatever vegetables. So there's these type of factors. The climate does affect the whole system overall, and of course the water availability. If you have a very wet summer or a very dry summer, it does affect what grows and which insects survive. And so it does play a role secondary to beekeeping, I say. Like if it affects the overall system where beekeeping takes place, basically. And
actually, Max, I think Emma has a question for you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, hello, Max.
Hey.
Hi. Well, I keep Western bees, but I don't have many hives. But I'm also and class myself as a naturalist, and I really care about biodiversity. Are Western bees always bad news for Japanese bees?
It's an interesting discussion, I think. If you ask Japanese beekeepers, they would complain about the Western bee, and I think the Western beekeepers complain about the Japanese bee, kind of.
I have quite a few come to my beehives. Japanese bees actually come right inside sometimes.
Right.
They're no threat to my beehives are much stronger than them, so
exactly
to me.
So I think it's what naturally there has been some publication about how bees actually, like, there's this interspecies activities. Like they seem to visit each other's hives, and it's like these scouting bees that, you know, they just fly around, and it might be part of what drones are doing in a natural system, because it was mentioned drones primarily are mating the queen, but there might be a role actually where they are kind of the eyes and ears of the hives, of just flying around. And
I heard about them, you know,
and
coming from different hives.
Yes, so there's these 1 or 2 bees that show up in your Japanese hive and just go in and out, and they don't get disturbed, and which it can be a factor in transmitting disease. It can be a factor in transmitting mites, right? Those that can be problems, really, if you're a commercial beekeeper and you have your interaction, the natural interaction happening, that could be an issue. But what if you open the YouTube, you will see these videos sometimes of like hives attacking each other. So if you have and that happens if your hive is really not doing well, like if they're sick or something is really going wrong, then the other beehives can sense that, and they might just go and take over the hive and really rob it. They empty it.
They get into a kind of frenzy, don't they?
Right. And it looks horrific. Like it's really an invasion of a box, you know. So that does happen, and it happens both ways. It can happen that your Asian bee is doing that to a Western colony, but also the Western, like or among each other. So there is this takeover, which just happens naturally, I think. And I haven't seen research saying it happens one way or the other more.
Okay.
And I have been also to Taiwan, where people also have Asian and Western honeybees. And there, what people say again is also it's the opposite of Japan, basically. So it always depends on the situation, I think, a lot, and the ecosystem. There's risks, but at the same time, yeah, it can work. Like it depends on the distance. And I think the biggest risk of what I've heard here, though, is that if Western honeybees would be mating your Asian honeybee queen, like that's possible, basically, but that it would result in the die-off. Like she would lay infertile eggs.
Right.
So they can mate,
then the
but
rest of the
cannot
colony would
fertilize.
be waiting for
because
her
it's
to die
different
off.
species. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so actually, it would result in the die-off of your Asian hive. So that does happen. There's a lot of detailed factors how they might pollinate more or faster, which then leaves less for natural pollinators. There's a lot going on basically in the system. So yeah, it's hard to give a detailed reply, I think.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.
Emma, is this look familiar?
Oh yeah. It's like, this is your life. How did that get there?
My great friend Catherine. Yeah, she gifted it to me.
I hope it's delicious.
Oh, I love honey, and I gotta say that I love all kinds of honey, and it's just a wonderful thing to get such a wonderful honey from here in Japan. So I'll give you a little plug. This is Emma's honey called Garden Honey. And Emma, what's your website?
Oh yeah, yeah, I do have a website. I can't remember it offhand, but I'm on Facebook as well, Garden Honey. I'm just a backyard beekeeper, so yeah.
Hey, I'm just a backyard farmer, so
yeah.
Where in Shikoku are you?
Tokushima.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really interested in Japanese honeybees, but I think like, it's in my environment, they'd just run away. They'd just go back to the mountains, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it depends. I think, I mean, Shikoku is one of the areas which has a long history of beekeeping, I think. And
yeah,
there's ways, even if they run off, you know, they might come back as well. That's the thing about the Japanese bee. Like, it's really, if you keep a few boxes, they might just come seasonally or something.
Oh, I hope so. Well, I mean, for the moment, I just tried to keep as many flowers flowering in the garden all the time and don't use pesticides, and tried to make other people aware of bees, even if they're not a native one. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a start, yeah.
What do you got there, Kenneth?
You know, well, this is a solitary bee hive, and I have a bunch of these around the place. Just because I'm a commercial beekeeper doesn't mean that I'm not interested in other pollinators. And
is that a mason bee or a carpenter bee kind of?
Mason bees, mostly in these ones. Yeah, we just take a block of wood, like a 2x6, and glue several of them together. Drill a whole bunch of, I can't remember what size holes they are, but and then I use like cooking parchment just to make like a little tube, like a cigarette tube or something like that, and put them in there, and then they start fairly off. They get going much earlier than honeybees do. They're critical, I think, in pollination of apple orchards in Aomori or Akita, and yeah, they do a really good job. The one thing about, they're not obsessed about taking honey back to the hive in the same way as honeybees are, so they're in fact much more efficient in their pollination.
Well, it's interesting because that was my first introduction to really being fascinated with bees, is when I went to France and I went to the gardens of Versailles at the palace, and I saw these boxes all over the place set among the fruit orchards. because the fruit orchards there are just phenomenal, the way they've trained those trees to be absolutely two-dimensional. And they've got these little bee boxes all over the place. And I thought it was like some just decorative art, but my friend said, no, those are for bees, and they're for the mason bees, and they're often bamboo used as the tubes.
Yeah, or Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed is a good one actually, but it's considered to be a very invasive species here. So people chop it down as fast as they can. Here's the crows back again. I'm more worried about them spraying it, of course, because it has really nice flowers, and bees love it. And,
is that kudzu? Is that different from kudzu?
No, it's kudzu is something totally different, but it's
totally different. Okay.
Yeah, that'll go right through concrete. But,
I know that's another invasive species that came over from Japan. That's why I'm confusing it.
Yeah, very much so. But yeah, I mean there are other. Of course, there are other things like teasels where they have a hollow stem, or it dies back to a hollow stem, breaks off, and solitary bees will be using that. And mason bees will anyway. Carpenter bees, they just drill a hole through your house.
Yeah, and I know that carpenter bees are a big problem here, and a lot of people try to get rid of them. But I use wooden posts around my farm for my monkey fences, and they bore holes into those, and I just let them go at it because I know they're doing more good than harm for my farm. So.
Yeah, well, most of the termites anyway. But yeah, I was getting back to what Max said about climate change. I mean, and very, very hot summers that we've been having, and the mild winters. We have a pest called wax moth. Max moth.
They named one after you, Max.
And that especially gets into stored equipment during the wintertime, and it just makes a huge mess in there. It's like having the whole place covered in maggots. So that's really not what you want. But I mean, normally you're looking for a nice spell of 20 below, and that'll do with them. Now I had to buy a chest freezer, and pull out all the frames that I thought would be vulnerable and put them in the chest freezer for a couple of days. At full max cold in it, and just cycle a whole bunch of frames through the chest freezer instead of relying on having a very cold winter. I mean, and in other areas of forestry, the mountain pine beetle, of course, that survived and proliferated because of the warm winters that we've been having, and it's devastated hectares and hundreds and thousands of hectares of forest there. And there again, this whole business of the lack of jive in pollination and the species and so on and so forth. If we're having we'll look forward to quite a damp spring, so that there's moisture in the ground, and that's going to come up as nectar, and then it gets too hot and it just like burns the plants all up at all. So, I'm having to have more hives every year to get less honey, especially over the last few years. Yeah. So it's a little bit like that. At what point, you say, oh, I got to give it up and I'll do something completely different.
And if you mentioned another problem that I'd like to refer to, and this was, I think, last year when you were here, you were saying that your bees were often feeding off of aphids, honeydew, rather than visiting flowers for the sugar or something like that.
Yeah, well, that's not in any way unnatural. It's just a question of you're maximizing your opportunities, and so like a cheap lunch, because the aphids are producing a nice little dot of nectar, and wasps and any kind of bee is going to land on that. And the aphids have no way of fighting back, and they're not putting up any kind of fight. I mean, you just land on the aphid and suck the little drop of moisture off. But the big problem with that is that it's a very dark honey which has a lot of mineral in it. So the bees don't survive very well over the wintertime because of this. Essentially it's almost like dust in the honey that they've stored over the wintertime. And in Central and Southern Europe, where this is reckoned to be very much like Manuka honey, it has you're supposed to have healthy properties there. Then the beekeepers there know exactly, say in the Black Forest, they know exactly how to deal with it. They'll eliminate every single bit of honey out of the hives before the wintertime and feed plain old sugar syrup to them, so they survive okay on that.
Does that affect the flavor of the honey for the human consumption as well? the aphid.
No, it's not. I don't know if you've ever had buckwheat honey. No, it's not. It's not actually gritty. You know, it's almost microscopic. I mean, you know, you would never know from eating it, but it's rather like buckwheat honey, very dark, sort of molasses-looking honey, and some people don't like it particularly, and some people just love it.
Max, is there anything like that happening here in Japan?
I think the honeydew, I don't know about the honeydew honey, if that's such a big thing here. From what I know, it isn't. I think the linden tree, linden honey, that should be from aphids usually, which is a market in Germany. But I think, and I have seen it here in stores, but maybe just because it's from Germany. No, not that I'm familiar with. I don't think it's such a topic. I know the buckwheat. You know, in Nagano, there's a lot of buckwheat. There used to be. It's also getting less, but it's so there's buckwheat honey there, and it's not popular with Japanese usually because it really has a strong flavor. But it's I think people in Europe generally prefer stronger flavor honey, or usually. And the other thing we have here is the because we talked about introduced species, the goldenrod. So goldenrod is something that came to Japan. It wasn't here originally, and so the beekeepers here try to harvest the honey before the goldenrod flowering and leave the goldenrod as a winter food, basically. But and goldenrod does crowd out local shrubs and plants. So it is an issue in a way, but it is also taking over pretty much. And so beekeepers are fine with it most of the time because it provides pretty good food, winter food.
Yeah.
And I have actually in Quebec, I did buy goldenrod honey as far as I know. So in other countries, apparently that's a thing. Yeah.
I see. Well, I mean, we're about to wrap up, but I wanted to ask both of you a question, and anybody else can speak to this as well. If we're looking to really support the bees, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the honeybees, but just bees in general, what sort of flowers or plants should we be planting or supporting? Perhaps, Max, you can speak to the Asian side of that.
It's hard. I mean, yeah, there's literature on that. I think you need to, for Japan, you really need to check Japanese references because if you check the internet in English, it's going to be mostly speaking about plants that are actually not from Japan, which to some degree is fine, but there's differences. So I think the what I would say is check what is the original local ecosystem and go from there. And I think what has been said before, avoid the green lawn kind of imagery. You know, don't get caught up in this suburban 60s English lawn kind of imagery and try to keep it all neat and clean. I think that needs to be avoided. It's a colonial image of the past that we have to get over everywhere.
Yes.
Like we need to have diversity over the seasons. Yeah. It needs to be, you know, something there every day, kind of. If you think about it, like it needs to be diverse, a mix.
Yeah. I mean, on my farm, of course, any farmer has the periphery of their farm with weeds and other things growing. And I often let them grow, and I often see things go to flower. And I'm worried because, of course, the next step is seeds, and that means more weeds. But I just watch the bees all over those little flowers, and I know that I should leave that there because that's not only supporting the local ecosystem, but it's also bringing the pollinators onto my field. So I'm in a unique position to be very interested in that. So
it's proven. There's research which says, I mean, it depends on your farm size, of course, but farm sizes we talk about in Japan, if you have flower strips around or in your farm, it increases your production in terms of size, taste, amount. Like everything has been researched when it comes to this. But of course, the larger the farm, the more problematic this gets. But yeah, on small farms, it's attracting insects or honey pollinators actually works. Like,
it does. I mean, I intentionally plant clover as a kind of a green manure or a green mulch. And I also plant marigolds in among some of my vegetables that does seem to bring in pollinators as well. So, but otherwise I try to let the natural stuff grow out.
I think for winter, because you asked, so as a green manure and pollen, then it used to be common in Japan to grow the veg. What is it called? Green veg?
Oh, hairy veg.
Hairy veg.
Mm-hmm.
One of those. Like there's different kinds, but that used to be really common. But it has changed with the mechanization of agriculture and all these kind of things. The cycles have changed, so that's become less common. But yeah, that's a way, a winter crop kind of.
Thank you, Kenneth. Maybe you can speak to that same question about what sort of things what sort of flora we should be kind of supporting or planting to support the bee fauna.
Yeah, well, I'm very suspicious of this, to save the bees greenwash or bee wash, in fact, notion about, try to raise a bit of money and support bees. Now, which bees are you talking about? Mm-hmm. We obsess about honeybees. Einstein said, if honeybees die out, then we'll die out as well. That's not true. I mean, the diet will become very boring, perhaps, but we wouldn't die out at all. I mean, he was great on, the general theory of relativity, but he didn't know much about bees. I mean, then you're going to see things like this.
He actually never said that, though. It's also not his quote, actually. He's misquoted on that one.
Okay, well, it's attributed to him, but anyway, it's wrong.
Well, we've all heard that, though. We have all heard that, I'm sure, and it's been, accepted as, that's true. So it's good to hear that.
I don't think it was Socrates either. Okay, so you're going to see things like this, a wildflower mix. I have no idea what's in it, actually, and they don't say either. But, it's been put together by a master beekeeper, so, I mean, that's what people do, that kind of thing. I toss this stuff around, but, leave well alone, I think, a lot of the time. I mean, my best honey crop really comes out of spotted knapweed and thistles and that kind of thing. And they're invasive species on undeveloped ground. And if if nobody's going to plow that, it doesn't invade commercial area very much indeed. So I mean, I'm relying on those other species I'm relying on weeds, essentially. I mean, weeds are good for bees. If they're not actually going to get into your cultivated area, just leave them alone. Any beekeeper's garden is going to look like a wreck, because we just leave absolutely everything alone, because we can see that they're going for the bacillus buttons and the poppies and all the other, and borage and all these other things that are around there, and they're going to get pollen from willow and alder and birch and so many different species. I can give you a list as long as your arm. Ending up with things like goldenrod, which actually is not very nice honey. So I mean, it's good for the winter storage end of things, but I don't particularly like goldenrod honey. But I think the spotted knapweed honey is really good. Or snowberries. I know that every single snowberry bush anywhere near my hives has got berries on it. And that's one thing I've noticed since I started beekeeping, is that the snowberries have suddenly exploded out of somewhere, and I know it's my bees. And the fruit trees and stuff like that, they pollen and nectar and so on and so forth. This general gentrification of suburban environment is one of the most dangerous things for it. And it happens so easily because people say, oh well, nobody will notice, or it's just me doing it and stuff like that. But it all adds up in the end, and we get a very dull environment to look at, and it's bad for all of us. And it's bad for our diets as well. This monocultures that we're relying on, and bad for society too.
Well, Emma has just posted some excerpts from a book, evidently. Emma, do you want to talk about that? I'm going to screen share the first one. Okay, there it is. Emma, I think you're still muted. Emma, you're still muted.
Yeah, I mean, I just had a few books on my desk that I borrowed from the library, and there's just 2 shots really, which just show like important nectar sources in Japan and the flowering period. But obviously, it will depend quite a lot on the individual region. But anybody that can get by in Japanese and is interested in, you know, what plants to plant for bees, then maybe you can use it.
Okay, I'll try to get the other one. Thanks, Emma.
Yeah, I think this is the second one, so it's like a double page spread.
Yep, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties getting
Yeah, well, whenever.
done
I mean, I find it so difficult. I mean, it's easy for me as an English speaker to get a lot of information from, you know, in English, but it's the crossover to Japanese, which is so difficult. And of course, beekeeping is very regional, so you know, I'm trying to get as much as I can in Japanese.
I tried to find a link maybe and put it and send it to Shaka.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, I'm going to put a lot of the stuff in the show notes when I can. So this is all good. So basically, Emma, this is just speaking to when these things are going to come into flower for the bees or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's the species of Japanese plant and the flowering period.
I see at the top it's the number of the months. I see.
Yeah, so it's actually in order. So the one you've got there is from July.
I see.
It's a double page spread, so it goes from the 1st.
Right. I'm having trouble sharing actually both of these at the same time. So let's try this one. Is that the one you're speaking of? This is the first one.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Very, very good. So these things exist, and we can look them up, and I'll put them in the show notes, of course.
Yeah.
Very
Copyright infringement.
No. I think it's in the good spirit of help. So I don't think
yes, of course.
Amazing. Well, I know there's probably some questions brewing in some other people's minds if you'd like to ask them. Some of you have been sitting quietly watching. Yes, please, dozo.
Hello, I'm Frank.
Hi, Frank.
I just wonder, what's the sort of cost to keep bees in Japan? And how many hives do I need per area?
Maybe Emma, you could answer that.
Yeah, you're talking about Western bees.
Well, I guess Western sounds the most plausible in the moment, as with the Japanese bees. I realize that there's a lot of they get a lot of viruses and stuff. So for pollinating, we have quite a large farm. So for keeping pollinating and making honey, I guess Western bees are.
Well, I think that the main setup cost is that you need to buy the first colony, and that is actually way more expensive than I ever imagined. So depending on its strength, you're looking at about 3 to 4 man, can be up to 7 man. But once you've got your first colony, then you can, if you can keep it alive, then you can split it and increase it. The boxes are the Japanese style of Western beekeeping is based on the Langstroth, which is exactly what was shown by, I can't remember your name, I'm sorry, Master Beekeeper. He showed you the deep frame. That's that size, but it's fairly easy to make as long as you abide by the measurements. It's fairly easy to make those hives yourself. To buy the boxes just off from a beekeeping supplier would be maybe, I don't know, 1.5 man, because you need to buy the bottom one and the top one as well. I can't remember.
Just for those of you listening outside of Japan, what she's talking about for the colonies themselves costs about $500 or $600 and the frames would cost about $125 or so. Just letting people know. Sorry, Emma.
Yeah.
These are sourced in Japan, or are you sourcing them outside?
Yeah, no, I sourced in Japan. So I bought them from a local beekeeper who is also very interested in kind of opening up and teaching people, which is pretty unusual because, you know, people are quite closed about it, and obviously it's their industry, it's their business, they want to keep things secret, where he's completely the opposite. So he's very open.
So
I'm wondering, do you have the option of ordering from New Zealand like Kenneth? I mean, New Zealand to Canada is a lot farther than New Zealand to Japan. I'm wondering if they import from there as well.
I think, as far as I know, Japan's got their own stock of Western bees, and they don't really import. I don't think. Anyway.
They import a lot.
They do. See, that's why you're here. Tell me.
They keep importing. It's these companies, you know. It's livestock industry, like everywhere.
Right.
They send around livestock. Yes, they import, and now lately they started importing. It shifted to Slovenia and Slovakia. I think it's now the most imported.
So they just import the queens, or?
Yeah, well, it's like this little. I think they come in little boxes, basically with a few bees.
Yeah.
Yes, that happens, and then of course they breed them, and then they sell them as Japanese Western honeybees.
Yeah, I mean, I just really hope to be able to get some kind of hygienic queen bee
Right.
that's adapted to, clean mites from it, and then start breeding them in the middle of a mountain somewhere.
I think, yeah, so I think that basically Japan, so they seem to have learned that. Like some years ago, there were issues in Australia, and they shut down and that was the #1 country to import from. And they shut it down totally, and so I think more or less that part is being controlled for like the commercial beekeeping. They are keeping eyes on imports of livestock and all this and seeds. It has been much more increased in the last 2-3 years than before. Yeah, so it's possible to buy from Japan. There's some Japanese companies selling you the whole package and deal and queens and everything. There's a few of these family-run businesses that do sell in an online shop. You can order it to your doorstep probably the next day, or so the Takyu-bin will bring it to you in Japan.
I'm curious. Is anybody importing Japanese bees? Japanese honeybees? Does it go the other way?
Like exporting, you mean?
Well, yeah. Is Japan exporting Japanese honeybees to other countries?
No.
Okay.
Not that I know of. Like, I mean, even already moving them from here to Osaka or something, like they might not like that part already.
Oh.
So
They being the bees or the people?
Yeah, the bees. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Like they are a bit delicate about it. So, but actually, we found a reference. They tried. It's not like so. There used to be attempts of moving when Japan was more colonial. They moved them from Korea or Taiwan. Like they tried to move around stuff in that period. Yeah.
Interesting. Kenneth, did you have something to add?
Yeah. Well, I think. Certainly, this last year, of course, because of COVID, there were no importations of bees from New Zealand anyway to Canada, and so that was a bit of a ruckus about that. But the other thing was the Suzumibachi, which was showing up in Washington State and in British Columbia. So I mean, that's
which is the Japanese giant hornet.
Yeah. That's the murder hornet. It was called in the papers. The murder hornet. So, I mean, anybody who knows a little bit about bees, and certainly the provincial apiculturists, he said to calm down now, I mean, it'll take a while anyway, and we understand how this thing works. Yeah, so I mean, people are always looking for something dramatic, and well, we'll see how it goes. We still haven't got the killer bees from Brazil, and I'm waiting for another one called small hive beetle, but we just have to deal with it as it comes. Really, it's still part of the natural system, but importing bees from another continent, I think is not necessarily a great idea anyway. We should be trying to build up our own native populations, such as they are, given that the honeybee, of course, is an invasive species in the first place, but it's here to stay now, I think. Yeah, but Derek, I mean, my beef is really about the solitary bees and the native pollinators, and I'm interested in saving those bees. I mean, that's what I'm interested in. And biodiversity is the issue there, I think. Yeah.
And I did read one of the things that you'd sent me earlier, Kenneth, about Texas, I believe it was, how the Asian honey market has really undermined the native or the Texas original honey production, and that beekeepers and apiists are really getting more money for offering pollinating services than actually for the honey themselves. That's it.
Well, yeah, when you're looking at pollination services, and you know, I would enjoin everybody to give up on the almond milk, because that's one of the worst examples of a monoculture that is just destroying the genetic source anyway, I think, because you know you've got all those bees and all they've got is almonds, and I don't know what almond honey is like, but they don't really worry about that. And then they're going on to blueberries, and then you're going on to citrus fruits, and then whatever. You know, in Canada, you know, most honey in Canada, it might be passed off as clover honey, but most of it is canola, which is GM. And there again, you're looking at monocultures again. And this issue about what's happening in Texas, yeah, I mean, it's just that the price of honey is being forced down by Chinese imports. And okay, we can say, okay, we're going to round that up and identify which ones of those coming from China, bust these guys and send it all back again. And, you know, bust the guys that are buying it. You know, never mind about the Chinese guys, they're just trying to make a buck. It's the guys at this end of things who are importing it and then blending it or falsifying the labels or whatever it is. I mean, the law says, you know, product of Canada, as long as it's 50%, I think you can say it's product of Canada. The rest could be whatever the hell you want out, you know, syrup, whatever you want in there. So that is a really big issue, yeah. And that's driving the price right down and making it very hard for the non-industrial beekeeper who isn't, you know, doesn't have a semi-trailer and is not dragging, you know, thousands of hives of bees around the whole of North America.
I mean, that was one of my first introductions about 7 or 8 years ago. I really began my love affair with honey in serious terms. And I would often buy the cheapest honey possible, of course, because I didn't know any better. And then I went into a honey shop here and found it's like 6 or 7 times the price, but it's also 20 times better for the environment, for myself, and better tasting. So that's when I really started to become more of a honey snob, and I would only buy the higher end honeys. And it was often imported from New Zealand and stuff. But then, Kenneth, of course, I tasted your honey and found out, wow, this is what craft beer is like to craft honey. It's just really, really well done. And then Emma's as well this past year when I tasted it, it's like, this is what's really possible with something like that, because it's not blended, it's very natural, and it's very raw, and it's very wonderful.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got people who never buy honey. You've got people, I mean, nobody buys honey every week. And, you know, I get little old Italian ladies just tell me, your honey's too expensive. So, well, you're going to buy it at the big box store. It says honey, but it's not really honey at all. I mean, what do you want? If you want to buy honey, you want to buy honey. You know, if you're buying something that says honey in the big box store, it's not honey anyway. So,
well, I mean, because is that at the farmers markets you're talking about?
I'm talking about the farmers market, yeah. That, you know,
so,
someone comes up to me and says, well, it's too expensive. Okay, well, fine. Buy what you want to buy.
Buy one of those cute little cheap old honey bear things and have it next to your honey on the table and be, okay, taste this, and now taste mine, and you tell me what's different. I mean,
if I could be bothered to do that, you know, I'm not in the business of dissing other beekeepers or whatever it is, but you know, I'm also in the business of educating people.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. We've only got about a minute left. I'd like to stop at 12 o'clock.
This is elderberry and mead.
That'll warm you up and put a smile on your face on a cold winter's night.
Oh, yes.
I wanted to say thank you
to
Max for being a part of this and giving us all the great information. And we look forward to your show notes and everything else and links that you'll provide. And Kenneth, too, you as well. You've provided us with a lot of information and a lot of things to think about. The great images and your experience has really taught us a lot. And everybody else who's participated, thank you for showing up. And it's been 2 hours now, believe it or not. But I think it's been worthwhile. I've certainly learned a lot. And I'm going to keep doing these kinds of podcasts to try to connect people and ideas and let people speak to some of the people in the industry of things that are important to sustainability and organic farming and things like that. Being a farmer, bees are really close to my heart, as I said earlier. So I was really happy to put this thing together. If you have any questions, again, check our show notes, and maybe you can get in touch with Max or Kenneth directly, or Emma, if you so choose. And other than that, I'm going to wrap it up and say thank you again to everybody. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you're in Japan, you're visiting Kyoto, look up Midori Farm's website, midorifarm.net, and come out and see us sometime. Until then, thanks everybody and have a great day.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.